Hello, everybody, and welcome to KGS Music Appreciation. The title of this video this week is Musical Form, Binary, and Ternary Form. And actually, originally, my plan for this week was to introduce you to what is called Sonata Allegro form. And as I started to make the slides for it, as I started to kind of break it down into more digestible units, those digestible units kind of started to multiply, and it got even more complex. To the point that I decided, okay, either this video is going to be way too long, or it's just not going to be intelligible. There's just too much information. So what I thought I'd do instead is kind of work my way to that more complicated form, Sonata Allegro form, with a little bit of an introduction to form itself and some of the precursors to that form, which are actually independent forms of their own. So here we go this week, binary and ternary form. Okay, so what is form? So my definition of form is how a piece or a movement of a piece is divided into smaller, more distinctive units. Now, what do I mean by that? So to return to my analogy of a film. When you watch a film, you're not watching a continuous stream of unrelated ideas. Otherwise, the film would not make sense. So think of how is a film broken down into more digestible chunks, or acts, let's say. There's, at its most basic level, you have a beginning section where a character is introduced. Perhaps the attributes of that character are also expressed. Maybe the context of what has that character undergone up until that point. That'll be also introduced. From there, you go on to the next section, the next act. A problem most likely is going to be introduced, something that the character has to undergo. And most likely they won't know how to solve it instantly. They have to learn, they have to grow. And that entire process is unfolded. And finally, there's the last section, the ending section. Let's just say there's only 3 in this case. You can have all kinds of subdivisions. There's an ending section. There's a section where, now that the problem has been somehow addressed, at least in terms of how it's going to be solved, it actually has to be implemented. And we see what happens. Maybe the character succeeds. Maybe the character fails at it. It entirely depends on what the director wants to do at that point. So that's how you experience a larger artistic product, in this case a film. You break it down into smaller, more digestible chunks that are related to one another. Well, that's exactly how a musical composition works. Anywhere from a symphony to a concerto, a string quartet, or an opera, it's the same idea. It's not one continuous stream of unrelated ideas. They're broken down into smaller, more manageable chunks. And if you can't listen to a piece that can go anywhere from 1 to 2 hours to 5 hours, if it's an opera, if you can't break it down in your mind when you listen to it into those chunks, it becomes incredibly difficult to listen to. So that's why form is crucial for your listening experience of a piece. It's crucial to be able to latch on to these ideas as they develop, and it makes it a lot easier to listen to and much more enjoyable to listen to. So in the bottom half of the screen here, just like a piece can be broken down into movements, or acts, let's say, so those movements can also be broken down into smaller forms. And we're going to discuss 2 of those smaller forms now, binary form and ternary form. Okay, so building blocks of form. Now, the important thing you want to know about musical form is it didn't just develop on its own. It was inherited from classical poetry. So when you think how you read a line of a poem, it's not just one monotonous tone. It's not tum, 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 tum. It has an inherent rhythmic drive, and it has a halfway point. It has an ending point. At the halfway point, there's an upper inflection. At the ending point, there's a lower inflection, just like in everyday speech. So here's this little poem that I wrote, my piece de résistance, if you will. It's Tam Ta. And here's how a poetic line would sound. tum ta tum ta tum ta tum, tum ta tum ta tum ta tum. So each of these tum ta is called a poetic foot. When you start to put these feet together in chunks of 4 or chunks of 8, most likely, that's the most common version, you get a poetic line. Tum ta tum ta tum ta ta is half of the line. Tum ta tum ta tum ta tum is the other half of the line. All together, that's one poetic line. You start putting poetic lines together, you get stanzas. And stanzas are the larger building blocks of poetry. Well, what is the musical equivalent of all this? So the poetic foot, the individual tumta, became the bar, or the measure, also called. You start putting a number of bars together, usually 8, again with a subdivision of 4 upper inflection, 4 lower inflection. That, what used to be called a poetic line, now becomes the musical phrase, which consists of, let's say, at least 8 bars. It can be broken down in all kinds of ways, but for our purposes, let's just say 8 bars is fine. All right, so let's take a poem itself. A famous Shakespeare poem. Let's say, "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate." At the halfway point of that line, there was an upper inflection. At the ending of that line, there was a lower inflection. And that was one line. Well, what's the musical equivalent of all that? Let's say this piece here. Okay, that was 8 bars of music right there. I'm going to count them out now. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And it's just held for that last bar. All right, so you can tell at the very beginning, it starts in a key, if you remember from the last video. After the 4th bar, you get to this chord. That's essentially the upper inflection. At the end of the next 4 bars, you get back to your home chord. So you can already start to tell what important role harmony is going to play in form. These subdivisions of phrases, they're very much harmonically driven. You start at a home chord, your tonic chord, you have to go somewhere. You don't just go somewhere in an infinite amount of space. You break that space down into, let's say, 4 bars perhaps. At the end of 4 bars, you've reached where that harmony wants to go, a related harmony, in this case, the dominant harmony. When you get back to your original home chord, again, it doesn't just happen in an infinite space. It's usually broken down into smaller chunks. After 4 more bars of that phrase, you get back to. So that's how this harmonic narrative develops. Now, when you start putting, this was one phrase, what I just played. You, of course, to constitute a larger musical section, kind of like a poetic stanza, you need more than one phrase. Well, that's how form starts to develop into larger chunks. Yeah, and that larger chunk is obviously going to be the musical section, which is essentially equivalent, like I said, to the poetical stanza. So a musical section at its very, very core has to consist of at least one musical phrase. And if you think about it, it kind of makes sense. Imagine if you're reading a paragraph of text. If there's just one sentence in that paragraph, there's really not enough information there to create a cohesive whole. You need a number of sentences, maybe at least 2, to kind of make sense of that as one chunk of information that relates to the other chunks of information. Well, that is a musical section. So the way that we talk about it within form is we designate letters of the alphabet. An A section, a B section, a C section, so on. And each of these sections, they can be related to one another, which in most cases they often are. Sometimes they cannot be related to one another. That also has its own meaning in itself. Of course, these sections can repeat, A, B, and then A again, or A, B, and then B again, or all kinds of variations there. And of course, they can be as long as a composer wants. They can be subdivided into smaller subsections. They can have any number of themes. It's pretty much entirely dependent on the will of the composer and the context of the composition. All right, so one more concept that I want to briefly touch on before we go on to the forms themselves is this concept of scale degrees, and more specifically the harmonies that are built on these scale degrees. So you'll remember from last week that the individual pitches of a scale, and consequently the chords that you can build on these individual pitches, they all have a natural tendency of their own. They begin at a home base, a home chord, which is called the tonic chord, and everything that happens afterwards essentially wants to return to that tonic chord. Now, the most important one for our purposes now is the fifth scale degree. It's called the dominant. Of all of the other chords here, the dominant chord or the dominant harmony wants to return to the tonic more than anything else. By virtue of its individual pitches, how it's built, its individual pitches have the most powerful drive to want to return to the tonic. So here's how this sounds. If you're in C major again, your home chord is this. Now, your chord built on the fifth scale degree is this. And that's the dominant. The dominant now, you can already tell, has an incredibly strong drive to want to return there again. Let's say, for example, I build another chord. Let's use the third scale degree, the mediant. Here's your tonic chord, and here's your mediant. It sounds really interesting, but it doesn't particularly have that strong drive to want to return specifically here. It wants to go to its own places. It has its own drives, its own energies. And usually all of these other chords really want to return to the dominant chord so that that dominant chord can itself want to return to the tonic. So that is essentially how tonality plays itself out within musical form. Pieces are divided not just in terms of numbers of bars or how long anyone wants a phrase to be. They are divided based on harmonic tendencies. You start in your home chord, a certain number of bars go by, you end up in your dominant chord. A certain number of bars go by again, you return to your home chord. So that's how this harmonic framework kind of plays itself out, let's say, within tonality, but more importantly, within musical form. All right, so to get to our first form of the day, binary form, the essence of binary form is that you have two sections, A and B. Obviously, that's what makes it binary. Now, these sections, of course, they're going to have some kind of related material between them. They're not completely independent works of their own. They're just subdivisions of a larger work. So they have to have some kind of a cooperative character, let's say. But at the same time, they're distinct enough that they have their own unique individual character as well. And you'll see that that little arrow there points to this other idea, AABB. So what I mean by that is, usually in binary form, the individual sections A and B are repeated, and they're identically repeated. That's why it's AA and then BB, exactly in that order, AABB. And that's how that's usually notated in music, when that little line with the two dots on each side means that whatever's inside that little graph is what is repeated. So that's AABB is your basic binary form, which makes it really good for dance music, especially. You can have any number of phrases you want within each of the sections, but especially for something like Baroque dance music, they would have maybe one phrase, let's say, one overall phrase of 8 bars in each of the sections. Each of those sections is repeated, and there you have a nice short dance. So it kind of fits very nicely for that context. Another crucial point about binary form, and really kind of all all form, is that the A section begins in your tonic key. So again, in a tonal piece, you begin in the tonic key, and the B section ends in the tonic key. So you begin in the tonic, you end in the tonic. That's how you know that's your home base. Anything that happens in between for dance music, most likely you're just going to go to the dominant, something very simple, something very clear. For extended binary form pieces, you could go into all kinds of crazy key areas that are maybe not the dominant. You can do all kinds of very interesting things. Or maybe you could just go to the dominant, whatever the composer wants. But that is the essence, essentially, of how binary form works. All right, so let's hear a binary form piece. So the minuet in G major here, I wrote was by Johann Sebastian Bach. I just found out actually it's not by Bach. It's by a contemporary of his named Christian Petzold. Nonetheless, it's still a great piece. It's a very well-known piece, and it's a perfect example of binary form. So what does it consist of? We have an A section and a B section. Each of these sections is going to repeat. So we have A, B, B. Each of the sections, in this case, consists of 16 bars, so 2 8-bar phrases. And most importantly, your A section begins in your tonic key of G major, in this case, and your B section ends in G major. So the entire piece begins and ends in your tonic key. What Petzold specifically does in terms of harmony in this piece is not particularly creative. The A section also ends in G major, and the B section also begins in G major. So he's a little more conservative, let's say, in terms of the harmonic motion. But it is a dance piece. It's supposed to be a very simple dance piece. It's a minuet. So there's no need to be harmonically complicated. Nonetheless, let's give it a quick listen. I'll walk you through the sections of the piece, and I'll just stop and let you know this is where the A section begins, ends, repeats, etc. Okay, so here we start with the A section. And A section repeated. And going into the B section. And B section repeat. Okay, so you basically hear how each of the sections, A and B, have their own distinct character. But when you combine them, they share some things in common. They have a rhythmic motif, or of course, the harmony obviously stays pretty much consistent throughout. So that's how binary form works. Two distinct characters of the sections combine to create one larger character within the form. All right, so a slight variation now on binary form is called rounded binary form. And if you look at the form itself here, it's actually identical to binary form. So it's still A and B. And if you do the repeats, AA, BB. What makes this one unique, though, is that music from the first half of the A section comes back in the second half of the B section. So let's say we have another piece just like the minuet with two sections, A and B. Each of the sections again have 16 bars, two 8-bar phrases. How would it go? You start with the A section and you play all 16 bars through. Then you repeat the A section identically. From there, you go on to the B section. The first 8 bars are going to be completely new and distinct music. But now the next 8 bars, instead of being new music, are just going to be a literal repetition of the first 8 bars from the A section. So the entire piece now has a rounded feel. Even though it's a binary form with two distinct parts, there's more of a rounded feel. There's more of a connection between those two parts. More of this, again, this sense of this thing that I keep coming back to of home base, starting from home base, returning to home base. And you can tell that this idea of home base, returning to home base, is just crucial in the 18th century, which is usually when these forms were kind of at their height. Okay, so here is a really good example of rounded binary form. This is the second movement of the Piano Sonata No. 6 by Mozart. Again, I'm just going to play it through and take you through. Here we go. And repeat of the A section. And now going into the B section, first half. And now the second half of the B section is the repeat of the A. And now a repeat of the entire B section. And it keeps on going from there. You can tell it's actually going to go into a very interesting form called theme and variations, which we're going to get into at some point. It's another very interesting form in itself. But for now, you get the idea. It's essentially the same as binary form. Music from the A section just comes back at the end of the B section. It's a very small twist, but it's a very important twist in this long narrative of 18th century form. Okay, and finally we get to ternary form. Now, ternary form, as you can see, it just has a certain number of sections, just like binary form. The pattern for this one, though, is A, B, A prime. So what that means essentially for us is you start with an A section, just like anything else. Can be as long or as short as you like, any number of phrases or themes, extensions, whatever you like. And then you go on to a B section. Now, the B section in ternary form, unlike binary form, which is distinct but pretty closely related, the B section in ternary form is markedly contrasting. It can have some related elements. Of course, it's still one unified piece at the end, so it's not completely alien to the A section. But it's markedly different than the A section. It's going to have probably a radically different character. Of course, new music to begin with, but it's going to really be almost its own sub-piece within the larger piece. And then the return to the A section again. The reason that it's called A prime this time is because it's not an identical repetition of the A section. For the most part, composers pretty much stick to what they did in the A section, but they change it up a little bit because it's at the end. So it's going to have, for the most part, the same A section character with some slight variations for musical effect and for emotional effect. Now, the way that you can also do this form, I wrote down one example here, is how do you repeat these things? Again, it really depends on what the composer wants to do. One example is you can quite literally repeat each of the sections. So AA, BB, A prime, A prime. Another way to do it is just repeat the A and B sections. AA, BB, and then A prime only once, because it'll be the third time at this point that we hear the A music. Another interesting one is AA and then BA prime, BA prime. So the B sections and the A prime sections are more closely linked, actually, and they're repeated as one unit. That's another variation on that. But composers do pretty much whatever they want there. Since, though, and this is probably the most important distinction also between binary and ternary, since there are more sections and each of the sections have their own character, they need to be developed a bit more. In binary form, you can pretty much get away with maybe a couple of phrases per section because it can be applied, like we said, to dance music and things like that. Ternary form, you need more time to really develop each of the sections so they have a markedly contrasting character. It's not going to be a couple of phrases long. So ternary form pieces, as a consequence, tend to be quite a bit longer than binary. All right, so I wanted to give you a good idea of a ternary form piece also, but like I said, they tend to be quite a bit longer than binary form. I did, however, find a movement here of a Symphony number 104 by Franz Joseph Haydn, which is about 4.5 minutes long. It's actually a great example of combinations, really, of ternary form with a little bit of rounded binary in there also. So again, I'm just going to play it through and talk you through each of the sections. In this case, though, since it's a little bit longer, each of the sections ABA is actually going to have subdivisions. So A1, A2, B1, B2, and then again A1, A2 with their individual repeats. So here we go. A1. A1 repeat. A2. And a little hint of the A1 music again. A2 repeated. B1. B1 repeat. B2. A little hint of B1. B2 repeated. And here's a transition for the return to A. And A1. A2. All right, so you heard in that piece a larger ternary form, ABA. The sections were completely distinct. The character of A was very different than the character of B. A was more triumphant, maybe more imperial. B was more relaxed, maybe a little bit more song style. You know, you can insert your favorite adjective here. It's all very descriptive and it's all very individual, but they were very distinct and markedly distinct, more so than in a binary piece. At the same time, though, within each of the sections, within the A section, A1, A2, you had a little bit of rounded binary. The music from A1 returned at the end of A2. And likewise, in the B section, the music from B1 returned at the end of B2. So these things are not mutually exclusive. A composer can do all kinds of things with form. And that's the basic idea here. So all of this is going to be leading up next week to what I started off by talking about as sonata allegro form, which is basically a confluence of everything. Confluence of binary, rounded binary, ternary form, and a couple of new ideas. But like I said, it's really I'd say the most important musical form of probably the 18th and the 19th centuries. It's the most interesting one because composers develop it the most, and they really make it their own throughout music history, basically. So we will see you next week, and have a great weekend.